When I lived down in Longview, Washington, the church I was a part of for 10 years or so was housed in this beautiful neo-Gothic revival-style cathedral. It was this very iconic church building. It was actually on the historic National Register of Historic Places. And because of that, a lot of people wanted to get married in our building. It was just kind of this quintessential, cool-looking building. And so I ended up doing a lot of weddings over the 10 years that I was there. And what I often encountered is that as I was working with these couples, they were way more interested in planning a wedding than planning a marriage. I had people go through marriage counseling, and a lot of people saw this as a necessary nuisance to endure so that they could get married in a cool building. Conversations about budgeting and communication and conflict resolution were less exciting than conversations about DJs and cakes and dresses, right? But the reality is, and those who've been married know, that once the big day's over, there's a whole life ahead that requires some intentionality, some work, some planning, some preparation. So I encourage couples to just recognize, let's not put all our energy into one day. Let's be asking this question, what's going to happen after the big day is over? And I think there's some parallels to the spiritual journey. In his book, After You Believe, or After We Believe, the Bishop N.T. Wright recounts a story of a conversation he had with a recent convert to Christianity. This man's name was James, and he had this unexpected conversion experience when he was invited to a church event. And James writes that all the old cliches suddenly came true. I felt cleansed, rinsed out, and more alive than I had ever been. But after a few months, after this profound conversion experience, he came to N.T. Wright, and he was filled with questions, and he didn't understand this question of what happens next. There had been so much emphasis in the church on redemption and conversion and the forgiveness of sins, which are all wonderful things about this entrance into this new life. But as he got into this life, he didn't really understand what came next. After the wedding, there was now this marriage, right? And so N.T. Wright talks about how sometimes as Christians, we can put a lot of emphasis on conversion and those turning point moments and those redemption moments. But we're often left with this bigger question, what happens after I believe? What happens after conversion? What is the invitation? And I've mentioned before that there's a bigger gospel out there that sometimes is overlooked in the Western church. We're not just saved from our sin, we are saved to a new reality. And that's what's going on in this second part of the Exodus journey. So the first part of the Exodus story has been this dramatic deliverance from Egypt. God has been saving them from bondage and slavery. But now they have been freed from Egypt, and the question becomes, what next? Right? After the dramatic event of crossing the Red Sea, what are we called to? What happens after deliverance? Now, they've been wandering through the wilderness, and this Lenten series is called Lessons in the Wilderness. What is God up to in these moments of testing and struggle and formation? And I mentioned last week the hopeful news that wilderness seasons in our life, or those moments of frustration or backwards movement, are not wasted times. In fact, they are very holy times often. God is doing formative work in the wilderness. And what God is doing is He is beginning to form a new kind of community. He has saved them from Egypt, but now He wants to form them into a different kind of community that will be a beacon of justice, a beacon of righteousness and light to the nations. And this requires that they be formed. Each step along the way in this wilderness wandering, they're learning new things. So in the desert of sin, they were learning to trust God's provision. Last week we talked about how they were learning to fight battles against malevolent forces by trusting God. Today, they are learning how to be organized for justice. This isn't as exciting as the dramatic river crossing, right? There's no parting seas. We're going to talk about org charts and leadership structures, right? It feels kind of boring. This is the marriage, not the wedding. But I want to encourage us to see that what's being discussed in this chapter is deeply important. What God is doing is forming this community to be a beacon of light to the nations. He's helping them organize their life such that there will be good news brought to their own people, but also to those around them. How we organize ourselves for ministry is kingdom work. It's important work. And so today, I want to look through this text at how we might organize our life together such that we will be fruitful. We will bless one another, but also bless a watching world and reaching out to those in need. What I'd like to do is just organize our thoughts around three movements today. And first, I want to look at the problem that is evident in this text. Next, I want to explore the solution that Moses discovers to this problem. And then third, we're going to look at the impact of this shift that happens in Moses' life. That's where we're going to head for the next few minutes. And so there's a problem in Moses' leadership. Now, the good news is that people are coming to him as a leader. This is a big shift from the early part of Exodus. We recall in Exodus 2 that they responded to Moses saying, "Who are you to judge? Who are you to lead?" Right? But now he's been established as a leader, and now there is too many people coming to him to pass judgment and to provide guidance, and he is overwhelmed with the work. He is burning out. And so this is the problem we read in our text. Sorry, I'm going to skip ahead a slide. What you are doing, this is Jethro's father-in-law, what you are doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. So Moses, though he is a great leader, appears to be not such a good administrator. And so he is being overwhelmed. And we see there's two parts to this problem. One, there's a problem for Moses. He is at risk of burning out. He's at risk of not being able to withstand all the responsibilities that he is carrying. But there's also a problem for the people. They are going away frustrated. They are spending all day standing in line at a government office that is understaffed, right? So imagine, maybe you've had that experience at the Social Security Administration or DSHS or the DMV. It's frustrating when your needs can't be met, right? And you're waiting in line, and that's what's happening. People are standing, they're seeking resolution to maybe a legal issue or an injustice that's happened, and they're not being served. There's a problem for Moses, and there's a problem for those that he is responsible for. It's too heavy. It's too much of a strain. Moses cannot bear this alone. And I just wonder if that names where some of you come today. Do you feel like your hands are growing weary? Are you carrying more than you can handle? Are you feeling the strain? Are you unable to care well for those who are entrusted to your care? I think that this is a common problem that we struggle with as leaders, as parents, as in our various professions. And perhaps some of you come today and you're feeling on the verge of burning out, and it's just becoming too much for you to carry. I came across a rewritten version of Psalm 23 a number of years ago. I forget the source of this, but it was in my files. And for those of you who know, Psalm 23 is this beautiful image of God making us lie down in green pastures and walking with us through the valleys and providing provision, and his goodness and mercy follows us. Well, this is the Psalm 23 revisited. That might be more of an accurate description of how you feel this morning. And so Psalm 23 revisited says this: "The clock is my dictator, I shall not rest. It makes me lie down only when exhausted. It leads me into deep depression. It hounds my soul. It leads me in circles of frenzy for activity's sake. Even though I run frantically from task to task, I will never get it all done, for my ideal is with me. Deadlines and my need for approval, they drive me. They demand performance from me. Beyond the limits of my schedule, they anoint my head with migraines. My in-basket overflows. Surely fatigue and anxiety shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the bonds of frustration forever." Does that name where some of us come today? Like Moses, I think we can relate to this problem of holding more than we can bear. And it's affecting us and it's affecting those around us. Thankfully, Moses is seen, and Jethro recognizes that there's a problem, and he speaks into Moses' life and leads him in a new direction. And what I want to just notice is how this shift takes place in Moses' life in a healthy direction, how that shift might take place for us as well. And the first thing that we notice is that Moses has some accountability in this text. And it comes in the form of his father-in-law, Jethro. Jethro sees this, and with great care, but also with great courage, he speaks into Moses' life and says, what you are doing is not good. That there is a danger of being burned out through what you're doing. And it just reminds me that we need Jethros in our life, right? We need those people that see us, that we're accountable to, that can speak wisdom over us, that can call us out when we're maybe going in the wrong direction. This was a really timely intervention by Jethro. There's been a lot of research done about clergy burnout, especially in these last few years with the pandemic. There's just a lot of people leaving ministry, and this is affecting other industries as well, and it's not just clergy alone. But in this study I was reading this week, one of the big sources of burnout in ministry, one of the big correlations they see is that people who burn out are isolated. They're isolated. They are not seen. They don't have Jethros in their life that they're accountable to or who will speak into their life when they are overextended. And I just extend that word to you. I wonder, do we have those Jethros? Are we seen or are we isolated? And if that's where we're at, I wonder how we might seek out that accountability, to reach out for help. On the other side, I wonder if some of us are called to be that Jethro to others. Maybe you see someone who's overextended, and there's a call in our heart to say, hey, what you're doing is not good. There's some need for you to get help. So there's accountability. But on the other side of this, from Moses' perspective, we see that he responds to this word from Jethro with humility. Good leaders are humble enough to acknowledge when they need help. And they're open enough to receive the correction and the challenge from other people. Now, Moses could have been at risk of being overrun by pride in this scenario. And I almost hear a little bit of pride from Moses at first when Jethro says, what's going on here? He's like, well, all the people come to me to discern the will of God for their life. And there must be, I suspect for Moses, there would be something that was very gratifying in that. Look at me. I'm the one that everybody comes to. I'm so important. And there's a danger in that. There is a danger in that becoming a source of pride that could lead Moses to not delegate, not seek help, thinking, I'm the only one that can do this, and they're all coming to me. And I feel important doing this work. But thankfully, Moses responds with humility to this word, and he doesn't allow pride to drive him to exhaustion. Ignatius of Loyola talks about two ways the evil one tries to derail us in our spiritual journey. I think I've mentioned this before, but he said, if the evil one can't get us to just directly oppose the will of God, and that's often the early on temptation in the spiritual journey, just to go away from the will of God, when that doesn't work, there's a second strategy of the evil one. And the strategy is, let's then inundate this saintly person with all these good things that they will then become ineffective. We're just going to say, do this, do this, do this, to the point where they are overwhelmed with good things, but they become ineffective. I think we need to be aware of that temptation to overextend ourselves and to be driven by a sense of pride, saying, look at all these good things I'm doing, I'm really important, let's just keep taking on more. But Moses responds with humility. Notice his humility in verse 24. Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. There's some interesting family dynamics. Like imagine Moses instead going to Zipporah and saying, your dad's just driving me nuts. Like he's telling me what to do again. Can you just ask him to lay off? Right? He listens to his father-in-law and does everything he says. That takes humility. And I wonder if that is a call to some of us. It takes humility to ask for help, to come to a place where you say, I can't do this alone. And I want to just name that as good leadership and affirm that when we're reaching out, when we're seeking out counseling or spiritual direction, or where we're saying, I need some help, I got to delegate some things. This is good leadership. It's good for you. It's also good for the people around you. Can we humble ourselves enough today to ask for help? And then the last movement that I think we see, the solution, moving away from burnout and exhaustion, is that Moses learns the art of delegation. This is just real practical stuff here. And this happens in a couple of ways. On a broad scale, Moses is called to teach and disciple others in the way of the law, in the way of God. And so we read in verse 20, teach them the decrees and laws and show them the way to live and the duties they are to perform. Moses is called to disciple people, to not make them dependent just on his teaching. He doesn't need to be the mediator of everything that is of God, but he's teaching them, in effect, to read their Bibles, to have their own rhythms of spiritual practice, to learn the ways of God. There's a call to disciple and to teach. And this might apply in parenting circumstances and other leadership things. Can we teach others to do the things that we are doing, to multiply the work through the ministry of teaching and discipling? That's what leaders in the church are called to do, not to do the works of ministry, but to equip people to do the works of ministry. That's Ephesians 4. And so we don't just come on Sunday to be taught the word. This is part of it. But we're also learning to do that in our own lives as well. Right? And then Moses is called to delegate the work to other leaders. Select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Right? Basically, he's setting up a court system where there's the Supreme Court, and then there's lower level courts, and there's an appeal process. Now, again, this is significant work because they have just come out of Egypt where there was no justice, where it was chaos, where there was a dictator. And God wants to form them into a new community, a community of justice and righteousness. And this requires delegation. We notice in this, though, that there's discernment in delegation. We're seeking to find people who are trustworthy, who love the Lord, who are not out for themselves, but out for the community. And so we're discerning who are those people that can do the work of ministry. I covet your prayers for us as leaders as we're now entering a season of discernment for the next associate pastor in our church as Janet's retiring in June. These are some of the questions we're asking. We want to be prayerful and seek people that care about the community, that are formed in faith, that are growing with the Lord. Would you join us as we seek that important work of bringing other people in? And this is the work that we are all doing in our different layers of ministry. This is a question I asked our staff as we were reflecting on this text in our staff meeting this week, and I extend this to you. What are you currently doing that somebody else could be empowered to do? What are you currently doing that somebody else could be empowered to do? Can we be empowering our kids to take on more, to grow in their faith and in their life? Around the church, we've got to ask those questions. How can we bring more people into the work of the community? This is good leadership to delegate to others. It's empowering leadership. Well, at the end of the text, we begin to see that what the impact of this shift is going to bring for Moses. And we read this in our text. Jethro goes on to say, if you do this and God so commands, you will be able to stand the strain, and all those people will go home satisfied. Right? And we see the potential impact for this shift in leadership. where we're empowering people, where we're delegating, we'll be able to stand the strain. But then those around us in our community will be well served. They will be cared for. They will go home satisfied. There are layers to the impact here. There's good news for us. There's good news for our community. But there's also a third layer, and I want to end with this, and this is more subtle in the narrative here. But the organization of the community of Israel is not just good for them personally. It's going to eventually be good for the nations. It's going to be good for those around them. They are being formed as a unique community, a community marked by righteousness and justice, markedly different than the community in Egypt. And the desire is not just for their own well-being, but that they might be a beacon of blessing to the nations. We go back all the way to Genesis to the calling of these people, and we see that God wants to make them a great nation, wants to bless them. And then notice the end, so that people, all peoples on earth, will be blessed through you. Will be blessed through you. Now here's something really interesting and unique that's going on in Exodus 17 to 19. And commentators point this out. If you want to do a deep dive, you can do some reading on your own. I'm just going to go over the outline of this. But there is an interesting parallel going on between Exodus 17 to 19 and Genesis 14 to 15. And this is what commentators note as this parallel. In Genesis 14 to 15, it's the same story. It begins with Abram defeating a hostile enemy, and that's what we saw in the story of Moses last week, right? They defeated the Amalekites. And then after that defeat, a priest from a foreign land, in Genesis 14 it's Melchizedek, acknowledges Yahweh and worships the Lord. And that's what we see with Jethro. Jethro is a foreigner. He's a priest of Midian. And in the early part of Exodus 18, he bows to Yahweh and says, "This is the true God." And then after that, there's this establishment of the covenant between God and the people. God established a covenant with Abraham. I'm going to make you a great nation that will bless the nations. And then in Exodus, after this scene, God establishes the Mosaic covenant. He's like, this is how we're going to be the people of God. Now, this is what's being communicated. At the outset of God establishing a covenant with his people, foreigners are in view. The nations are in view. There's this prefiguring of the nations turning to Yahweh. It came with Melchizedek. It came with Jethro. Right at the outset, as they're forming this new kind of community, that we're being told that it's not just for you. This is going to be good news for the nations. I'm forming you as a unique community so that you can be a beacon of hope, a beacon of light, a beacon of justice to those around you. There will be more Melchizedeks, there will be more Jethros who will see who I am and will worship me. So the impact of what we're talking about here is not just for us personally, not just for our community, but it is also for the good of our world. How we live our life together matters. It's a way that we can share good news to the world. Now, here's where I want to end. This is also our story. This is our calling as a church. And so in 1 Peter chapter 2, we read, "But you," and this is speaking to the church, this is speaking to you today, "you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God." That's taken right out of Exodus 19, some of that language. And now it's applied to the church. And we are called to be organized and to live such good lives among the pagans in the midst of the nations that though they might accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits. How we live our life as a church, as a community, matters in the world. We are called to live as a countercultural community, a community that is marked by love and righteousness and goodness. And when we do that, others will find God. They will see a new way to live. Now, the challenge to us is that we need to do this together. There is a trend right now, and an understandable trend, that people are saying, I am spiritual but not religious. And I have some empathy with that because some of us have had some hurtful experiences with organized religion. And there's kind of this rejection of the institution. I want to just go it on my own. I'm interested in God and spirituality, but I'm just going to leave that whole organized religion thing behind. I can empathize with that. But can I suggest to you that the problem is not organized religion, the problem is disorganized religion. The problem is dysfunctional religion. And some of us maybe have emerged from churches where there haven't been healthy leaders, that were prideful and they burned out and they brought things down with it. Or there wasn't justice and righteousness and people were not cared well for. And we carry that hurt and that's understandable. But sometimes, instead of seeking to reform the institution, we reject it. But the call in this text reminds us that we need one another to do this work. We need Jethros in our life. We cannot go solo in this work. It's together that we are a light to the world. So can I call us not to just reject religion, but to reform it, to be part of this corporate work of living life together in such a way that we become a light to others. John Calvin once said this: "One ray of sun is not meant to illuminate the whole world." And that's why we are called to community. It is together as we live this life where we're refining one another, where we're supporting one another, that we become light to the world. Church, I want to just spur us on in this. I know that you do this well, but I want to continue to call us into community, to engage community, even in the challenges that it brings, because it's together that we can be a light to the nations. I've seen you do this well. I'm just thinking of a story of a way that played out in our church last summer. As many of you know, we were part of a partnership with World Relief as we hosted a literacy program for recent refugee kids. We hosted a camp for these new arrivals, people that were just coming to this new country, learning new languages. And what was beautiful, what I noticed about this is that as we came around this vulnerable community, there were some people outside of our church that were seeing this happen. There are some people that are interested in refugee work, some students at Western, some people that are interested in literacy work that were also involved. And it was beautiful to see how our example of living justly and caring for the vulnerable was a witness to those on the fringe or outside our church. And there were some comments from people saying, "It's so beautiful to see the church like this." It was proclaiming justice, proclaiming the goodness of God as we organize our life around the values of the kingdom of God. So can I call us to continue that work? To engage in ministry? We need all hands on deck. We're kind of bursting at the seams with kids ministry, so if you're looking for a way to help out, or in other areas of ministry, we want to empower and come together to do this work. And when we do that, I believe we can be a light to the nations. Well, as we conclude our service today, I want to have some extended time for response and prayer. And once a month, we have this rhythm at Bellingham Covenant Church where we have what's called our prayers for healing time. And we're going to have some time to worship and to sing. But I just want to acknowledge that some of us in the room today have weary hands. And maybe you're coming today and it's just you're feeling the strain, you're feeling overwhelmed. We want to leave room for you to call upon God for help and to reach out. And maybe some of us just need to humbly come down and kneel before God and say, "Lord, would you help?" And so I'm going to invite the musicians to come up. I'm going to invite Janet to come forward. Janet's going to be available for prayer at the station. I'll be available over here. We'd invite movement in the room if you want to walk across and be a Jethro to somebody and reach out and pray and say, "I see you, I care about you." But would you stand and let's enter into this time of worship, trusting that God wants to do some healing, some restorative work in our midst. And would you join me in prayer? God, I pray that you might be at work, that this text would come to life now, that you would restore those weary hands, that you do some healing work in our midst as we now respond to you in worship. Amen.